Picture a sandwich counter. Fried shrimp, oysters, roast beef in brown gravy, bread so light it crackles when you press it. You think you know what it is. You don't. Not really. Because the po' boy was not invented in a restaurant. It was invented on a picket line, in the summer of a strike, by two men who had once driven the very streetcars their friends were trying to shut down. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about New Orleans food. The city's most iconic dishes are not tradition handed down intact across centuries. They are the product of collision, poverty and abundance, old world and new, labor and desperation, pressing against each other in one of the strangest ports in the world. The po' boy took a German immigrant's bakery, a Creole kitchen's fried seafood, and 100 men walking off the job in 1929 and made a sandwich. Why New Orleans? Why this bread? The answer runs 300 years deep. To understand why New Orleans made the food it did, you have to understand how improbable New Orleans is in the first place. In 1718, French governor Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville chose a spot where the Mississippi River curves toward Lake Pontchartrain. Swampy, flood-prone, surrounded by bayou. The city's original Choctaw name was Bulbancha, place of many tongues. The Choctaw had traded here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, because this bend in the river was where the entire interior of a continent funneled its goods toward the sea. By 1840, New Orleans had grown to roughly 102,000 people, the third largest city in the United States, the wealthiest in the South. That wealth came through a sugar industry built on enslaved labor. By 1860, over 300,000 enslaved people worked Louisiana's sugar operations, producing around 90% of all American sugar. Every layer of this history shaped the cuisine. The city's position where the Mississippi meets the Gulf of Mexico gave it shrimp, crawfish, oysters, crab, a larder no landlocked city could touch. Okra came from West Africa via enslaved people. Filet powder came from the Choctaw. French, Spanish, and West African culinary traditions blended into what became Creole cooking. And the 1809 migration from Saint-Domingue and Cuba brought 3,102 free people of color and 3,226 enslaved individuals to the city in a single wave, making New Orleans 63% black. But there was one thing the city could never grow: wheat. The humid Gulf South climate was not right for it. The French bread that would become the po' boy's essential vessel arrived here as an imported ingredient. And bakers had to learn to make it work in a climate it wasn't designed for. That's where a German immigrant family becomes part of the story. George Leidenheimer opened his bakery on Dryade Street in 1896, arriving from Deidesheim, Germany. He was not the first German to feed New Orleans. That tradition stretched back to 1719, when some 450 families from the Rhineland settled along the west bank of the Mississippi, roughly 30 miles from the city. Historians credit those German farmers with the survival of early New Orleans. They grew food on the natural levees and shipped it to the city by river. They also introduced something that would echo through Louisiana culture in an unexpected direction. German settlers brought the accordion, which became central to Cajun music. Leidenheimer moved his bakery in 1904 to Simon Bolivar Avenue, where it still operates today. He made New Orleans French bread, lighter, fluffier, crispier than a baguette. Less flour, more water, adapted to Gulf South humidity. When you hold a piece of it, it is almost weightless. And it was that formula, that deliberate departure from Old World baking, that made the po' boy possible. On the Creole riverfront, a parallel tradition was already in motion. By the late 19th century, fried oyster sandwiches on French loaves were known as oyster loaves in New Orleans. African-American and Creole cooks had been pairing Gulf seafood with that bread for decades. The 1900 Picayune Creole Cookbook, compiled from recipes traced to women, the book called Old Creole Mammies, was documenting a cuisine built by Black and Creole hands and largely attributed to nobody. What remained was a name, and for that, you need two men from Raceland. Raceland sits on Bayou Lafourche in Lafourche Parish, 44 miles southwest of New Orleans, deep in Louisiana's sugar plantation country. Benny and Clovis Martin grew up there, moved to the city, and became streetcar conductors. By 1921, they had saved enough to open a small restaurant near the French Market, the oldest public market in the United States, where vendors had sold raw seafood since colonial times. In 1929, more than 1,100 streetcar workers, members of Division 194 of the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway Employees, known as the Carmen, went on strike against NOPSI on July 1st, demanding better pay. The Martin brothers, former carmen themselves, wrote their colleagues a letter that became famous in New Orleans labor history. To the striking Carmen Division 194. We are with you till hell freezes, and when it does, we will furnish blankets to keep you warm. Records show the Martins served free sandwiches to strikers throughout the 4-month walkout. Benny Martin later said that whenever a striker walked in, he called to the kitchen, "Here comes another poor boy." But here's the part that complicates the clean story. One New Orleans historian noted the Martins' streetcar strike narrative wasn't recorded by local press until 40 years after the fact. Before 1969, the brothers had described their sandwich as made for dock workers and market vendors, not specifically for strikers. Also in 1929, bakery owner John Gendusa first baked the specific bread shape used for the po' boy. The two bread families would eventually merge when Leidenheimer absorbed Angelo Gendusa's operation in the 2000s. The truth is probably this: the sandwich existed in some form before the strike. The strike gave it a story large enough to survive. So why did the po' boy work? Not historically, economically. Why did a sandwich made from imported wheat bread and Gulf seafood become the food of working-class New Orleans rather than a luxury? The answer is in the bread. As the Deseret News noted in 2006, everyone seems to agree that it's the bread that makes a true po' boy sandwich. A French bread known for being crispy on the outside so that it can hold up to the filling, with a light, airy interior. That lightness was a cost efficiency. New Orleans bakers developed a recipe with less flour and more water, a loaf that used fewer expensive imported ingredients while producing something larger and more filling than a baguette. You could feed more people with the same amount of wheat. The bread was the economic engine of the sandwich, not just its vessel. The fillings completed the equation. Shrimp, oysters, and crawfish were cheap protein in coastal Louisiana, landed at the wharves by the ton, moving through the French market at working-class prices. A dressed po' boy, shredded lettuce, tomato, pickles, mayonnaise, was a complete meal a dock laborer could actually afford. The Wall Street crash arrived in October 1929. The same month, the streetcar strike ended. What had been food for laborers became, almost overnight, food for a city learning to survive on less. The po' boy was depression food that happened to taste extraordinary. Leidenheimer was ideally placed to supply it. The bakery bought out its largest competitor, Rising's Sunrise, in the early 1990s. After Hurricane Katrina flooded the city in 2005, Leidenheimer briefly produced bread in a Chicago bakery to keep the supply alive. A measure of how seriously the city took the continuity of its food. The po' boy also produced one of its most interesting variants through the economics of combination. A sandwich containing both fried shrimp and fried oysters is called a peacemaker, or la mediatrice. The name comes from an old New Orleans tradition. A husband returning late would bring one home as a peace offering. The story may be apocryphal. The sandwich is not. The po' boy today is served across New Orleans with the same dedication other cities give to civic monuments. There is an annual Oak Street Po' Boy Festival each November in the Carrollton neighborhood. Tens of thousands of people, outdoors, eating sandwiches, in a city that already has Mardi Gras. New Orleans is the only city in the country where this specific bread, lighter than a baguette, crispier than a hoagie roll, is produced at any meaningful scale. Leidenheimer still supplies most of the city's restaurants. The company's delivery trucks carry artwork by Bunny Matthews, creator of the Vic and Natalie comic strip, added for the bakery's centennial in 1996. But the po' boy carries a history of erasure as much as celebration. The Creole cooks who first combined fried oysters with French bread, many of them African-American women whose techniques appear in the 1900 Picayune Creole cookbook, credited to unnamed old Creole mammies, did not receive credit or ownership. The labor that built the Gulf seafood supply chain, loaded the wharves, drove the streetcars, that was black and immigrant labor, documented in the sandwich's DNA, but rarely in its official history. The muffaletta tells the same kind of story from a different angle. Created in 1906 at Central Grocery by Salvatore Lupo, a Sicilian immigrant, it reflects the Italian community that arrived in the late 19th century. Two sandwiches, each a portrait of a different community pressed into the same city. As late as 1902, 1/4 of New Orleans' population spoke French in daily conversation. By 1929, that same city produced a sandwich with a name derived from English, Poor Boy, serving Creole food on German immigrant bread. The city's whole history compressed into a single meal. The po' boy shops came back after Katrina. The Oak Street Festival resumed. It is a measure of the city's refusal to disappear. So, was the po' boy born on a picket line in 1929? Or was that story assembled 40 years later to give a sandwich a better biography than it had? Probably both things are true. The Martins fed striking workers. They called them poor boys. The strike gave the name a myth large enough to survive. New Orleans has always been a city that builds meaning from crisis. Founded on a floodplain that should have drowned it. Shaped by waves of people. French, Spanish, West African, German, Cajun, Sicilian, Vietnamese, who each arrived with nothing and left something in the food. The po' boy is what happens when all of those layers press against each other in one hot, humid, improbable city. French bread adapted for a climate it wasn't made for. Gulf seafood from waters nobody else had. A name that started as an insult and became a civic identity. A city built to move other people's wealth, kept none of it for the poor. And the poor made the best sandwich in America anyway. What other American dishes were born from labor disputes? There may be more than anyone has counted.